رمضان 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 فرصة عمر.
If you look at the Muslim world, you will see people of all colors, nationalities, and languages. Islam is not a religion specific to the Arabs, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not sent only to them. Rather, it is a religion for all people. And he was sent by Allah with a message to all. One's race or nationality or language does not make them of a higher status by itself. Rather, what makes a person better than another is their piety, their level of adherence to the rules of Islam, and their level of obedience to Allah. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا فضل لعربي على أعجمي إلا بالتقوى, which means there is no preference for an Arab over a non-Arab except by piety. The Prophet's own companions and beloved ones were a mix of Arabs from different tribes and regions, as well as non-Arabs. So, Islam is appropriate for all people regardless of ethnicity, and its rules may be taught to all peoples in whatever language they may speak. But, despite all of that, Allah did give the Arabic language a special merit. He revealed His book, the Qur'an, to the Prophet in Arabic, and He made it the most eloquent book ever recited. For this reason, the Muslims throughout the centuries have been keen to learn Arabic and teach it even if their original languages were different. And you would find that the scholars of each Muslim country, even the non-Arab ones, would be fluent in Arabic so as to understand the Qur'an and the Hadith and teach their meanings and the rules derived from them to the people in the language that they understand. They would also write books explaining the rules of the religion in the language of the people to help them learn these rules and teach them. They would even write explanations of the Qur'an or the Hadith in other languages to help the people of those areas study their meanings as well. However, in recent years, some people have taken on a bad habit, a habit that is not permissible, that we must draw attention to. They take the Qur'an and they try to translate it word for word without any explanation. And they translate the whole book in that manner and print on the cover the Qur'an or the Holy Qur'an, and then pass it out to the masses to read on their own and interpret for themselves. And so a lot of lay people sit down with these books, reading them, thinking that they are reading the Qur'an, when in reality they are not. The translation does not have the same judgment as the original book. Allah said in the Qur'an about the Qur'an, وَإِنَّهُ لَتَنزِيلُ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ نَزَلَ بِهِ الرُّوحُ الْأَمِينُ عَلَى قَلْبِكَ لِتَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُنذِرِينَ بِلِسَانٍ عَرَبِيٍّ مُبِينٍ, which means it is certainly revelation from the Lord of the universe. It was brought down by Gabriel, the trustworthy, into your heart, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, so that you would be among the warners in a clear Arabic tongue. And Allah Azza wa Jal also said, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا, which means we have revealed it to you as an Arabic Qur'an. These verses mean that the Qur'an is in Arabic. That is the language Allah revealed it in. And so if you recite something in another language, you are not reciting Qur'an. Translating the entire Qur'an literally, word for word, is not permissible. Among the scholars who stated this is Al-Imam Al-Shafi'i, and Al-Imam Al-Tabari, and Al-Imam Al-Zarkashi, and Al-Imam Al-Nawawi, and others. First of all, it is not possible to transmit the meanings of the Qur'an properly by translating the entire thing literally, word for word. In Arabic, there are words that have multiple meanings, and the intended meaning is known through context. There are many examples like this in the Qur'an. There are even words in the Qur'an that can bear two opposite meanings, like the word quru'. It is the plural of the word qar'. It can mean the time when a woman is on her menses, and it can also mean the time when a woman is not on her menses. There is no equivalent word for this in other languages. Likewise, the word mawla, which is also mentioned in the Qur'an, it can mean slave and it can mean master, and it can mean emancipator and emancipated. There is no equivalent word for this either in other languages. So it is not possible to translate these parts of the Qur'an by trying to find one equivalent word for each word of the verse from another language. Rather, if you want a speaker of another language to understand these verses, you must explain. Second of all, there are many verses in the Qur'an that are not literal. Rather, they are expressions whose true meaning is something other than the apparent literal one. To explain this issue, let's establish that the verses of the Qur'an are of two types: ayatun muhkamat, decisive verses, and ayatun mutashabihat, ambiguous verses. Allah said in the Qur'an, هو الذي أنزل عليك الكتاب منه آيات محكمات هن أم الكتاب وأخر متشابهات, which means He is the one who revealed the book to you, O Muhammad. Within it are decisive verses, they are the foundation of the book, and others are ambiguous. The decisive verses are either made up of words that bear only one meaning in the Arabic language, or the intended meanings are known with clarity. As for the ambiguous verses, they are verses made up of words that can bear multiple meanings, multiple different meanings in the Arabic language, and the intended meaning is known through context. These are verses that are not as clear in meaning as the decisive verses, and in order for the common people to understand their meanings properly, they must refer back to the scholars who are qualified to interpret them. The ambiguous verses also refer to the verses that mention things only Allah Ta'ala knows, like the exact time and date of the Day of Judgment. Now Allah referred to the decisive verses as the foundation of the book because they are a reference for the scholars and interpreters of the Qur'an to refer back to when interpreting the ambiguous verses. Meaning that the interpretation of the ambiguous verses must correspond with the decisive clear verses. For example, the verse لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, meaning nothing resembles Allah in any way, which we talked about in a previous video. It is a decisive, clear verse. Therefore, all the verses about Allah in the Qur'an must correspond with this verse. Otherwise, the Qur'an would have contradictions in it, which is unacceptable. So the verse, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, for example, which is an ambiguous verse, must correspond with لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa is an ambiguous verse because some of the words in it can bear many different meanings in the Arabic language. Istawa, for example, has roughly 15 different meanings in Arabic, and the intended meaning is known through context. Allah said about Himself in the decisive verses, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, meaning that nothing resembles Him in any way. So when interpreting this ambiguous verse, we must use a meaning that does not entail likening Allah to anything. The word istawa in some contexts can mean to sit, but if we were to interpret it here with that meaning, the verse would mean that Allah sat on the throne. And this would entail likening Him to many things. Sitting is an attribute of the creations. Humans sit, dogs sit, etc. Istawa can mean in some contexts to be fresh or ready. The Arabs say, istawa at-ta'am, meaning the food is ready. But this meaning is also not appropriate for this ayah. Istawa can also mean to float. The Arabs say, istawat al-khashabatu ala al-ma', meaning the wood floated on the surface of the water. But this also is not an appropriate interpretation for this verse. Istawa can also mean to be equal to something. This too does not fit the verse. And istawa can also mean to subjugate something or to control it, especially when used with the word ala, as is the case in the verse, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. This is an appropriate meaning when attributed to Allah. And so it becomes clear that the ayah really means that Allah subjugated the arsh. The arsh is the largest body that Allah created. It is physically larger than paradise and hellfire, and the earth and everything else. So by revealing that He is the one who subjugated the arsh, who controls it, and so by His will only does it stay in its place above the skies and above paradise, Allah showed His great power over everything. Because if He has power over the largest thing, then He has power over everything else. This is why Al-Imam Ali radiyallahu anhu said, as is famously narrated from him, إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَ الْعَرْشَ إِظْهَارًا لِقُدْرَتِهِ وَلَمْ يَتَّخِذْهُ مَكَانًا لِذَاتِهِ. Which means Allah Ta'ala created the arsh as a sign of His power, but He did not take it as a place for Himself. As for Allah Himself, He does not need anything. He does not need the arsh or anything else. So we do not attribute Him with sitting on the arsh or being held up by it or being physically on it or above it, connected to it or disconnected. None of that is applicable to Allah. Allah said in the Qur'an, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ, meaning nothing resembles Him in any way. And we said that this is a decisive verse, one of the foundations of the book. So, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa must comply with this verse in its interpretation. And had the meaning been that Allah is sitting on the throne or established above the throne, then He would resemble many creations that are sitting on things or established above them, and this would lead to a contradiction. On top of the fact that the Qur'an agrees with what the rational mind dictates, and a rational mind concludes easily that the Creator cannot be like the creation in any way, because He existed before them without them, and He exists now without changing. We talked about that in a previous video. The true meaning of Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa is that Allah subjugated the throne. The true meaning of Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa is that Allah subjugated the throne. Not that He is established upon it or sitting on it. This path of interpretation was chosen by many scholars of Ahlus Sunnah. And others, especially among the earlier scholars, used to read the ayah and then simply say, bila kayf, meaning that this word istawa, we attribute it to Allah, but without a modality or a how, meaning without attributing anything created to Allah, like sitting or being in a place or a direction, or being connected to something or disconnected from it, or any other physical attributes, because Allah is not a created thing. They would negate the improper meanings for the word by saying bila kayf, but they would refrain from assigning a specific meaning to it in interpretation, like to subjugate, because at that time people understood Arabic much better than they do now, and misguidance pertaining to this issue was much less common, so they didn't see much of a need for assigning a specific meaning explicitly. Both of these methods are acceptable in interpreting Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa and all of the other ambiguous ayahs of the Qur'an. And the two groups of scholars are both Ahlus Sunnah. What is not acceptable, however, is what many people who publish so-called translations of the Qur'an do nowadays, where they translate the words of the ambiguous verses like Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa literally, with the physical or inappropriate meanings of the words, and then distribute them to the masses, many of whom have not actually sat with a trustworthy teacher or scholar and learned Islamic belief. And so you would find them thinking that Allah is a physical being similar to us, which is blasphemy and completely contradictory to the Qur'an, completely contradictory to what the Qur'an actually says about Allah. Most of the so-called English Qur'ans out there translate these ayahs incorrectly and say that Allah is sitting on the throne or established above it, or that He is everywhere, because they misinterpret another ambiguous verse of the Qur'an, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ, to mean that Allah is everywhere, when it actually means that He knows about you wherever you are. This ayah as well was never meant to be translated literally with a physical meaning. For all of these reasons and many more, it is impermissible to translate the entire Qur'an word for word without any explanation. Nor is it possible to do so correctly. What is permissible is to translate the tafsir, the explanation of the Qur'an, into another language, so that the metaphors and the non-literal expressions that appear all over the Qur'an would be understood correctly by people who speak other languages and use other expressions other than the expressions used in Arabic. Now, I will mention one last thing before wrapping up. Muslims know, in general, that innovating things in our religion is not to be taken lightly. In another video, inshallah, we will talk about the issue of innovations at length and clarify when they are acceptable and when they are not. But in general, innovations are a serious matter. And nowadays, you have certain groups of people that claim to be very strictly against innovations, and they spend a lot of time accusing people around them of being innovators, often unrightfully, something that we will clarify in another video. And what amazes me is that translating the Qur'an word for word, using only the literal physical meanings of many words, and then calling it the Qur'an or the Qur'an in English or Spanish, etc., then supposedly doing da'wah and calling people to Islam by handing out these books and telling them to read them on their own with no clarification or explanation is all a big, big innovation. And yet, many of the people who take that route are the same exact people who purport to be against innovations and who spend much of their time accusing others of innovating things in the religion. And often they're very aggressive about it. It's very strange. It seems that to them, whatever suits their fancy is acceptable, even if the Prophet and his companions never did it. But whenever something does not suit them, it's an innovation. And that right there shows how misguided and unqualified to speak on religious matters such people are. This method of translating the Qur'an and telling non-Arabs or even ignorant Arabs to read it by themselves is not the prophetic method of teaching Islam or spreading Islam. Rather, one must learn the correct belief and the rules of the religion first from the mouth of a trustworthy, qualified teacher. Then after that, they can delve into learning the interpretation of the Qur'an. Although that as well must be done through a trustworthy, qualified teacher. It is narrated from Jundub ibn Abdullah, the companion, that he said, "Kunna fityanun hazawira ala ahdi Rasulillah." We were young, strong men in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَكُنَّا نَتَعَلَّمُ الْإِيمَانِ قَبْلَ أَن نَتَعَلَّمَ الْقُرْآنِ. And we used to learn Iman, belief, before learning the Qur'an. ثُمَّ تَعَلَّمْنَا الْقُرْآنِ فَازْدَدْنَا بِهِ إِيمَانًا. Then we learned the Qur'an and our Iman, our belief, increased because of it. That is the proper method of learning Islam.